Well, welcome back. We hope you enjoyed your break with your exhibitors and had a chance to meet with them and talk about everything that they have to offer. Next up is our presentation on maximizing employee motivation through creative compensation with Beth Carroll. Beth Carroll is the founding partner of Prospero Group, a business consulting firm that focuses on strategic management of compensation for global transportation and logistics companies. Beth is based in Chicago, Illinois, and has over 20 years of experience developing incentive compensation plans for companies across the globe in a variety of industries. Prospero Consulting has completed projects with more than 200 transportation and logistics companies. Beth holds a BA from Bucknell University and an MA from the University of Chicago and an MBA from Northwestern University. It is a World at Work certified sales compensation professional. Beth is the author of Taming a Compensation Monster, Using Freight Brokerage Compensation to Drive Urgency and Performance and Profits. It is available on Amazon in softcover, audio, and Kindle editions. And I would suspect from Walmart.com as well.
Over there. And over there.
And over there. So please welcome Beth Carroll.
Thank you, Tom. All right, can you guys hear me okay? Am I good? Oh, I'm very loud. That's good. That's awesome. All right, and the clicker's working. I hear there was a little bit of a problem with an earlier presentation, so I wanted to make sure the clicker was working. So good to be back doing this again live. This is my first time doing this in this kind of a format in probably 18 months. So hopefully I'm not too rusty with this. I've done this a bunch of times through webinars, but not live for a while. Were any of you by any chance at the McLeod conference in 2019? Any hands on that one that heard me speak at that one? Whatever I do today, it's going to be better than that. I had no voice because this is allergy season for me. And so I whispered my way through the entire presentation. So I figure if that's my bar, it's going to be easy to clear that one. Okay, so quick agenda in terms of what we're going to do today. Very brief introduction to me. Tom already did a great job with that. We're going to jump into talking about how do you develop a cohesive compensation strategy for trucking companies. You have a lot of different roles. They're very complex and they're very intertwined. So you have to be careful how you think about compensation when you start to think about using incentive compensation for these roles. Going to go quick run through 6 fatal mistakes. If you get nothing else out of this, don't do these things and you will be in good shape from a compensation design perspective. I have a few slides on Comp 101. This is a very trimmed down version of a much bigger presentation that I give. There's a lot more content. Feel free to go out and look on my website. I've given these presentations through the TCA, through the TIA, through a number of different associations. So if you're members of them, you can find them out there as well. If you would like to get more detail, if you would like to have more meat on the bone here in terms of the content that I'm going through. Also, my book is over there, so feel free to grab a copy. If I happen to run out, leave me a business card and I will be happy to ship you a copy for free. Got a couple plan design samples for you guys from some actual work that I've done. Names have been removed, of course, to protect the innocent, but some actual samples of designs that I've done for trucking companies that I've worked with. And then if I talk fast enough through this, open Q&A at the end. And if not, you can always come up and ask me questions at the end as well. Okay, so quick introduction to me. Tom already said all this important stuff. I'm overly educated. That's all you need to know. I've been involved in a lot of different industry associations. I've spoken, I've written, I've done articles, I've done radios, podcasts, pretty much everything you can imagine at this point. And in the last year and a half, a whole lot of live LinkedIn things that I've done. So actually live broadcasts that way. The fun industry to work in. So I have worked with a lot of different industries. So I started my career, once I got out of graduate school, I started with a big HR consulting firm doing sales compensation consulting. Most people don't realize that that is actually a profession. You find it typically in places like my old company, which was Towers Perrin. Now they're Willis Towers Watson, Mercer, Hewitt, if you recognize any of those names. That's where compensation consultants typically live. I was with them for 10 years. That's how I learned to do what I do. I always had an entrepreneurial mindset. I wanted to run my own company. And so at the end of 2007, that was about the time that it was really starting to become an itch for me. And fortunately, at that time, I was working with CRST Logistics in their freight brokerage group. So it was just very happy coincidence for me that I left Towers and I had a transportation company that I was already working with. They became my first client in the industry. That was at the beginning in 2008, which was a fantastic time to launch a new business. If you guys remember what happened at the end of 2008, I survived it, got through it. I've actually been running my company ever since then. And so I went from one transportation client in 2007, 2008 to I've now worked with, what's that number? 338. I've worked with 338 transportation companies. Started in freight brokerage, so that's sort of where my base is. I started speaking at the TIA conference and going around doing a lot of industry association, 20 group presentations, that kind of thing. And so it has just expanded from there. So freight broker led to working with trucking companies, which led to working with warehousing companies, which led to working with private fleets. There just doesn't seem to be any end to this, which is wonderful. So it makes for a very, very good career for somebody who's trying to make it on their own in this world. These are some of the companies that I've worked with. I'm sure some of the names you will recognize on here. Is Miller here? Anybody from Miller Transfer in here? Somebody's nodding. Yes, raise your hands. So they're one of my clients of the last couple of years that I've worked with them. And then a number of others in the Ohio market. I'm certain you're going to recognize names up there. Panther, of course, got acquired by ArcBest. FedEx Supply Chain, FedEx Custom Critical, Jarrett, I'm trying to think who else, Ohio. Think of it by airport is how I usually go. All righty. In the trucking world, so specifically thinking about trucking companies, so whether it's LTL or truckload or flatbed or overdimensional heavy haul, whatever kind of asset-based operation you have, there are myriad different roles that can be compensated using incentive compensation. I have to always thank Prime. I did not work with Prime. They did their thing long before I was even on the scene in this world. But many of you are aware, I think it's very common knowledge, that Prime basically compensates everybody in their organization using variable compensation down to the receptionist, okay? A number of other companies have followed suit on this and have asked for ways that they can come up with variable compensation or incentive compensation for their various roles within an asset-based company. It makes a ton of sense because you guys are so dependent upon economic swings. You need a way to manage what is probably your biggest fixed costs outside of maybe your capital investments in your actual trucks. Labor is probably one of the biggest costs that you have. And so you need a way that you can flex that up and down as the economy goes up and down. So I work with companies to figure out how is best to do that for all of these different roles and then some. And there are roles on here that I have never heard of, that I had never heard of before. And I'm like, I don't really even know what that role does. What does a weigh and reweigh manager do? But I learned that in an LTL environment, that's actually a revenue generating function. So it's possible to come up with an almost sales-like compensation plan for that role. So all of these things and more. We also run the only freight broker compensation survey that exists in the world. It typically has somewhere between 60 and 80 participants. So I know a lot of asset companies have freight brokerages attached to them. So if you're looking for data on what to pay, how to pay freight brokers, you can get some of it from the survey as well. One of these years, I will launch a trucking focused survey as well to get into the detail for load planners, driver managers, that kind of stuff. I've looked at the various surveys that exist out there. They don't, in my mind, they don't quite go deep enough and they don't get specific enough. So I try to get really specific in terms of the roles since I know them so well at this point. Okay, so how do you think about developing a cohesive compensation strategy? The first thing you have to do is understand where you are on the growth cycle. There's a startup mode that is typically pretty flat. Everybody does everything from an organizational perspective. Few roles in the organization, and there's really two compensation approaches that are gravitated toward. Either it's going to be 100% salary or you're going to have more 100% variable depending on your funding. If you have enough cash that you can pay people 100% salary, my bet is most of you are going to go that route. A lot of the freight broker startups that I work with go the 100% variable route because they don't have the cash. They're starting up in their garage and they're just going to split the margin between whoever's working in the group. Makes sense when you're small to do things this way. But as you start to get bigger, things become more complicated. You have more role differentiation. You have different customer segments. So you've got to start to think about how do you pay people from what's called a cost of labor perspective versus cost of sales. So when you pay somebody 100% commission, and when I use the word commission, I mean a percentage of revenue or a percentage of margin. A lot of people in the general population use the word commission to mean any way you pay a salesperson that's variable. In my world, there's a very specific meaning for the word commission. You can also pay people, you can pay salespeople goal-based incentives, bounties, banks, piece rate. You guys know from a driver perspective, drivers are, that's called piece rate when you pay them by the mile. So there's all these different mechanisms that you can use to pay people that are not all commission, right? So when I say commission, I mean percentage of revenue or percentage of gross margin. So when you pay people using that methodology, that's called cost of sales. You're thinking about, here's how much profit I'm going to have. How much can I afford to share with whoever this person is that I want to compensate in this variable manner? Once companies start to get to a big enough size, they need to start to shift to think about paying people based on cost of labor. And I guarantee you all understand that this year because the market has changed, right? It is what do we have to pay people in order to get them in the door? That's cost of labor. Doesn't matter, frankly, whether you can afford it or not. If you need a body, this is what the rate that you're going to have to pay to get them in. And so this year, more than any other year that I can remember, I've had more people coming and asking me, what's the going salary for a load planner? What's the entry level salary for a driver manager? Because it has changed so quickly. My survey data that I collect as of the end of 2020 is already out of date. I look at that and it's like, this isn't right. I know this isn't right because the salaries have gone up so much since then. Okay, so if you're asking yourself that question, you are dealing with a cost of labor philosophy, and that's a good place to be, but it can create some problems if you're trying to transition out of the startup mode. Once you become a market leader, then things get really complicated. Now you start talking about having compensation committees and boards that are reviewing your compensation plans, all that kind of thing. You really need to have a sophisticated HR department and a sophisticated compensation management program. Salary bands, career levels, merit increases, all that kind of thing comes into play at that level. So that probably overwhelmed you a little bit thinking about, well, how am I going to do that in my world? Especially when you're talking about asset-based transportation companies, you have all of these different roles and more. This is just a basic diagram of what I know of asset-based trucking companies. They're all interconnected to one another. So it's very hard to figure out, well, I just want to do a comp plan for my sales reps, or I want to change my driver pay. I get asked that one a lot. Well, guess what? It's really hard to change your driver pay if you aren't also looking at how your driver managers are paid. So one of my very earliest driver pay projects, I was all excited about it. I had not dealt with truck drivers before. And I was figuring out how to do this and was being a little bit too complicated in terms of some of the math that we were doing. But we put in basically, if they got to, I think the number was 2,500 miles. If they got to that level, they got a kicker. And I was rolling it out to the drivers and telling them about it. And they said, you know what? I know I'm going to land at $24,999 every week, $24,999. I'm like, why would you do that? Because my driver manager wants to screw me over. I said, so your company hired me to come in here, develop this plan only to not pay you. But you know, as well as I do, that that's the way they think about it. So that lesson to me at that point was, you've got to also look at how the driver managers are paid. And if I had been able to say to that driver, guess what? Your driver manager also gets a bonus when you get to that level, it would have taken away some of that concern. So you have to really think about how these roles all interact and how they could play against each other or work together. There is actually a way to start. So rather than trying to think about tackling all of these at one time, my preference is to actually start with driver sourcing. The driver shortage isn't going away anytime soon. So I think recruiting is always a good place to start in terms of incentive compensation design. Then think about driver retention and fleet operations. So your driver managers or load planners. I think that's a good place to start as well. Then get into your drivers. As I said, don't start with the drivers. Make sure you have these other roles incentivized first and that they're going to be doing things that are going to support the drivers. Customer sourcing and customer retention, I think, come next, which is interesting. Normally, you start with sales. In this world, I don't think so. I think that's later down the road to make sure that you're getting the right kinds of business once you've got the plans put in place for your operations. Then you can get into asset management, and then after that, your back office roles. One thing you have to be careful about. So if you have heard about the prime model and you're enamored with that and you think you want everybody in your organization on some sort of a variable compensation plan, take a good hard look at yourself, your systems, your processes, the people that you have doing the calculations. This is not going to work for everybody. It was in Prime's DNA, I think, when they actually started, and they've built their whole company around this philosophy. I've worked with other companies that have tried to put that in after the fact, and it breaks them. They just give it up. They'll run it for maybe a couple months, and then they'll realize it's way too much work for what they're getting back out of it, and it doesn't make sense to do it. So one of the things you want to be really careful about is, are you getting the ROI? If you're going to put the time and energy and effort into developing a variable compensation plan, is it for roles that if they change their behavior, you will see noticeable result in your bottom line? If you are paying an accounting person 2 cents per bill they process, you aren't going to see a difference in your bottom line. You might make that accounting person happy, might not, might be just as soon to put it in their salary, but somebody's going to have to sit and count up how many bills they process and multiply that by 2 cents. Is it really worth it for you to do that? So keep that in mind as you start thinking about going down this path. Focus on the roles that drive the business results first. And then if you have time and you've built up the stamina and the strength to be able to do complicated incentive calculations, then maybe put it into place for your back office staff. Okay, so 6 fatal mistakes. If you can avoid these, you'll be in good shape. So the first one is not realizing that compensation is part of an interconnected system. You have to think about your company culture, your org structure and your roles, your desired position in the labor market, and your business strategy and objectives. Compensation, this is my logo, by the way, and there's a reason for it. Compensation sits right in the middle of all of that. So it's like the engine that drives the car. But if you're putting the wrong engine in the wrong car, you're going to blow it up. Either you're not going to go anywhere or you're going to completely blow it up, right? So back to my analogy with Prime, they have a Ferrari engine in terms of compensation. You need to be really careful that you're not putting that in an organization where you've got you-go managers, right? So you just want to make sure, because it's not going to end well if you do that. You've got to be very clear about where you are starting from. Okay. Think about, this is mistake number 2. Incentive compensation is about more than money. This actually is kind of connected to number 1. It's part of your culture, okay? I always tell my clients that what I do is half math and half psychology. I actually think it's probably 25% math and 75% psychology, because you really have to think of the message that your compensation plan is sending. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here, and you tell me what this tells you. I'm not telling you anything. I'm not even telling you the industry that these companies are in. All I'm telling you is company A pays their people, we can say it's sales reps just to make it easy, salary with a discretionary year-end bonus. Company B is 100% commission with strict rules about clawbacks and a charge to the employee when support resources are added. What impression do you already have about those 2 companies? You probably can tell a lot about how teamwork oriented they are, how entrepreneurial, how competitive, how paternalistic. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying that you know nothing about those companies other than their compensation plan, and you probably have a good idea of some other aspects of how they're run. Some of you may go, oh, I only want to work for company B, and others of you may go, I only want to work for company A. That's another thing to keep in mind, is not everybody out there is wired the same. There are very few what I call never enough hunters that are going to gravitate to company B. A good compensation program actually takes into account that you have a variety of different personality types in your organization, and make sure that you're hitting on as many of their different buttons as you possibly can. And I tell you, a cheap one is recognition. Just giving somebody an attaboy, letting them know they did a good job, that you appreciate their hard work, that goes a long way. So if you can get that into your management staff to get them to start doing that with your drivers, with your office employees, that can help with your attraction and retention tremendously, and it doesn't cost you anything. Focusing too much on fair often misses the point. So if you think about incentive compensation as only being a math problem, you're going to find yourself all tangled up in all sorts of bullet points, footnotes in your compensation plan about circumstances when you will or won't pay somebody. You are way missing the point if you're doing that, okay? You are not doing this to create a perfectly fair economic relationship between you and that employee. If you pay that employee a salary, guess what? You already don't have a perfect economic relationship. You are not every day getting the exact value for the salary that you are paying that person. Maybe sometimes you get more, maybe sometimes you get less. Incentive compensation is about driving behavior and results, not creating a perfect economic deal. Would you rather have your salesperson out closing a new sale or arguing with your accounting department about why a short pay wasn't credited in their last check? I think I know the answer to that question. Okay, mistake number 3. Incentive comp design is a constrained optimization problem. There is no perfect incentive plan. None. Isn't going to happen. And there's no perfect incentive plan that's going to last you for 20 years. In fact, I guarantee if you have the same plan that you've had for 20 years, there's something about it that is not right anymore. The world has changed in the last 20 years. Your compensation plan needs to be flexible and adaptable to change with it. It's a strategic tool, and as such, it should be malleable for you to use. You have to think about the trade-off decisions that you're going to make here, and there is always a trade-off decision. For every gain, there is a loss. I know this presentation so well, I'm actually saying it before the words are on the screen. Finding the right balance for your company is what you need to do. You also need to think about how things are going to change in the next 10, 15, 20 years, to the extent that any of us now can have any prediction on that, because that's, in the last 2 years, things changed more than I think any of us could have ever imagined. But one of the big things that I will say, and I'm certain these exist out here, is if you are paying your sales reps on an annuity, okay, so that is they land a new customer and they get 1% of revenue in perpetuity for that account, that is going to cause you a problem at some point in the future. There will be some point where that sales rep is not working nearly enough, in your opinion, and making too much money, in your opinion, and not bringing any new customers, in your opinion, right? The sales rep's going to think they're doing absolutely fine. They're like, what's wrong? I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. I did it 10 years ago, but you know. So that's the kind of thing you have to think about. Put yourself into the future. How is this going to work 5, 10 years from now? Mistake number 4, more is not a goal. I often hear managers say, well, if my employees want to make more money, they should sell more. They should do more. They should produce more. They should manage more drivers, whatever more is. More is not a goal. You actually need to tell people what good looks like. That's some of the biggest value, I think, from the work that I do with my clients, is forcing them to define what their expectations are. Okay, you want to pay somebody $10,000 a year in their incentive pay, and you want to pay it based on revenue per truck per week. Okay, well, let's talk about that. You guys all have those KPIs. I know you do. You know what that number is that you need to reach in order to be profitable. Have you compared that to what the average driver manager is able to pull off in terms of their collective drivers that they're responsible for. Do those two things even come anywhere close together? And then if they don't, how do you get them to try to move that needle up? So you need to let them know what good looks like. If you're paying somebody through a commission mechanic, where it's a percentage of margin or a percentage of revenue, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. Actually, you can communicate good through the compensation plan. This ain't it. This is a flat rate commission plan. Do you have any idea what good is on that plan? A sales rep on that kind of plan is going to back into it. They're going to say, okay, I want to make $100,000. My commission rate is 5%. I'm going to divide 100,000 by 5%, and that's how much I need to sell. Okay. Well, that may or may not align with what your expectations are for that sales rep, right? They may think they're doing a great job, and you may think they're doing a horrible job. You're going to be misaligned, and they're going to go, well, what are you upset at me about, right? I'm doing exactly what I need to do on the plan you gave me. So one of the ways that you can start to communicate good is by building tiers into a commission plan. This is a very, very simple adaptation for a straight line commission plan. This first way to do it, though, is not the best way. This is a retroactive commission plan that basically says when you get to the next level, you get that rate back to the first dollar. Sometimes it's called a $1 commission plan. It creates this stair-step effect. And so that when you get to that next $1 that gets you over the line, the return for the person on the plan is disproportionate to that one additional dollar created. You can actually get an idea of what the target expectation here is. And in fact, I usually highlight it on the table. In this case, it's 25,000. That's the point at which target pay would be earned. You want to have it be right in the middle of the table, which is another thing, little sidebar here for a minute. But a couple of years ago, there was a big trend with driver compensation to talk about having them have, starting with say 100 points or 1,000 points or something like that. And then throughout the month, they would lose points. Any of you guys had any programs like that? Maybe somebody? Nope, you guys are not raising your hands much today. Though that's horrible from a psychological perspective. So maybe it's good. Maybe you guys were all smart enough to not do that. You always want to have people have a chance to win as well as lose. If you tell a driver they're starting with 1,000 points and they're only losing points from there, that's very demoralizing. It's a very depressing program to be on. You want to say, always have a chance for them to gain as well as lose. It's the same for any compensation plan that you're putting together out there. Set your bar in the middle, right? This is where you want to be. This is your target production amount, your target pay amount. Show people how they can make less than that if they're not up to par, and how they can make more than that if they are exceeding. Now, the reason why I said a retroactive plan isn't that great is precisely because of that economic imbalance between that one additional dollar generated and the amount of money that person gets paid. You would actually just as soon have them land. I don't know if I've got a pointer here. Yeah, I do. You would just as soon have them land at the bottom of these steps. And I call it the intelligence test for your organization if they're not figuring out how to get right there, right at the very beginning of the step. This is back in 2008. This is why our mortgage industry blew up, because they were all on retroactive commission plans. And so it behooved them to pad the loan packages, because the more they could shove into their plan, they would get up to that next step. And for them, it wasn't $250. It was thousands of dollars that they were getting additional in their compensation. So you have to be really careful with this. When I've come into freight brokers that have this plan, I can almost always find either one of two things going on, and there's probably other ways to game it. But one is carrier reps buying and selling loads from each other in the parking lot, or customer reps buying accounts from each other. They're actually trading things back and forth. I had one person actually tell me that they had worked out a deal with their customer that at the end of the month, the customer would put more dollars in the loads to get the guy, the internal customer rep, over the tier. And then at the beginning of the next month, he'd pay it back to them basically by having less money come from those loads, from that customer. So you've got to be really careful about how these plans can be cheated. A much better way to do it is what I call a progressive or a marginal commission rate. This is like taxes. The problem here, remember I said there's always a trade-off. It's better mathematically. It's more of a pain to communicate. I give you that, okay? So this is where the commission rate is paid only on the dollars within the tier. Now in this graph, I've made these 3 plans pay exactly the same amount at target. So it's not about changing how much somebody is paid at target, but it does have a pretty significant impact, or it can have a pretty significant impact on what happens to people who are underperforming and what happens to people who are overperforming. Now, I manipulated these lines in terms of the way they work to show this exact thing. You can see under the progressive plan, the top performer is going to make significantly more than under either of the other 2 approaches, but the bottom performer is going to make significantly less. Most of the time, that's the outcome people want. Every now and then I'll have a company that says, you know what, let's just we're trading off this stair step. Let's have that progressive line just kind of cut right between those stairs. It's perfectly easy to do that. Not easy, but you can do it. You just have to monkey with the formula a little bit to get it to work. Okay. All right, this is just an example, by the way. That's not to say anybody should be or shouldn't be paid those rates. Mistake number 5, and I don't need to tell you guys this, right? There are laws about compensation. What is it? California AB 50, AB 5? Yeah. I'm working with some companies now that have drivers in California. And so we're trying to work around how is this going to work in terms of all of these requirements. It goes beyond drivers, right? So beyond drivers, you guys all know about FLSA, right? You know about overtime laws and exempt versus non-exempt. 2016 made us all aware of that. I'm assuming you guys are aware that the rate, the bottom salary level did go up. It's around 36,000 now. You guys know that, right? If you're going to classify an employee as exempt from overtime, the first thing that the government is going to look at is what is their salary wage base. If they are not paid a fixed amount, I don't remember what the number is now, but it's going to be equivalent to some number, a weekly number. If they don't get that equivalent, then it's do not pass go. You don't even get to look at the duties test. Okay. If they were not paid a salary wage at that level, it's around 36,000 a year, then they would automatically be classified as non-exempt and you need to be paying them overtime. Please don't shoot the messenger. If you've not heard this before, just go Google FLSA and it'll have all the details there for you. Okay. Couple other things that you have to think about from an incentive perspective is there are laws about holdbacks. You have to be really careful how that is phrased because there are some states, not just California, but there are other states where if you tell a sales rep that they have earned money, but you are holding it back until a future date, such as when the customer has actually paid you, that is actually not legal to do and the rep can sue you to get that money. It particularly comes into play when they leave, right? They will say that that money is owed to them. Okay, again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you how it is. I'm not saying whether I agree with it or not. All commission plans in California. So if you pay somebody a technical commission, which is a percentage of revenue or a percentage of margin, it needs to be documented in a particular way. So I use the word incentive. I don't use the word commission. I've actually tried to get as many of my clients as possible to purge that word from their vocabulary because probably half the time they're not actually paying them using a commission from this definition, from what like the California Labor Board would say is a commission. So if it's not a commission, why call it a commission and get yourself in trouble with these documentation requirements? If you're paying a goal-based incentive, a goal-based incentive says you have a quota of $1 million. You hit your quota, I'm going to pay you $10,000. If you get to 80% of your quota, I'm going to pay you $5,000. If you get to 120% of your quota, I'm going to pay you $15,000. That's a goal-based incentive. That's not a commission. So don't call it that. A commission is only percentage of revenue or percentage of gross margin. All right, the last one. And I checked before, I was like, it's okay if I say half-ass here? And they said yes. You can't expect to half-ass your compensation plan and yet have it work 100% for you. So I've worked with hundreds of companies to develop new compensation plans. Success depends on one thing and one thing only. You need to own it. It's not my compensation plan. I'm going to give you advice. I'm going to design it. I'm going to help you put it together. But when I walk out the door or whoever helps you design it, it's not mine, it's yours. You have to understand it. You have to believe in it. You have to be able to communicate it. You have to know the data that underlies it, and your management team has to believe in it and understand it as well, because those people are going to have questions. I don't care how clear it is. I have seen the simplest compensation plans and people say they don't understand them. So you have to have your managers know the plans, support them, and communicate them and reinforce them. Okay, so I hit on a couple of the points, but I'm going to make sure I said them all. You and your leadership team understand it and all of its implications. Know why it is the way it is. You guys made trade-off decisions when you were designing it. You couldn't do everything you wanted. There's something that got cut and is on the cutting room floor, okay? You need to be able to understand why that happened, because somebody sometime later, maybe it's a new operations manager that's going to come in, is going to say, well, why in the world aren't we doing this in our compensation plan? You got to be able to explain to that person why it is, because you don't want that person now saying, well, this is the stupidest plan I've ever seen. We've got to go do something else. You just put a whole lot of time and energy into developing your plan. Another thing you don't want to do is change it every 3 months. Ideally, it should live for a year before you start making changes to it. You've got to make sure you've got the data needed to support it and resources to get the data regularly. If you can't measure it, you can't pay on it, period. Have the data tested and make sure that you know who's going to win and who's going to lose under this plan. You want to make sure that you are prepared for what's going to happen. Compensation plan changes, except when we're talking about drivers, rarely have everybody win. Now, when I do driver compensation plans, my underlying assumption is nobody loses. Nobody goes backwards on those plans. When you're talking about your general population, that's probably not true. Some people will make less and some people will make more. You need to know why, be able to explain it, and coach up the ones who might make less. Use care when you're setting goals. That part especially cannot be half-assed, because if all your methodology for goal setting is going to be 10% growth year over year, your company is going to get really pissed off at you after about 3 years, because they're going to say it can't just keep always going up and up and up and up and up. There has to be some mitigating factor in here. One of the primary compensation or goal setting problems that I run into with trucking companies is they do their goals just based on growth, year over year growth, right? You don't get paid anything until you achieve year over year growth from last year. So what happens? You have, it's called porpoising, right? Like a dolphin going in and out of the water, a porpoise. So they have a good year, they have a bad year. They have a good year, they have a bad year. And the sales reps, when I talk to sales reps in organizations that do this, they start counseling the newbies, don't have too good of a year, because then it's just going to be harder for you to hit your goals next year, right? That's not a good compensation plan. You don't want your sales reps not trying. So be very careful about how you set goals, and make sure you've communicated it to your staff with examples so they know how it works, okay? Don't change it at the drop of a hat. You've got to live with a plan for a while. It takes 2 full pay cycles for your employees to even begin to understand it. So you've got to let it go at least that long to see if it's going to start to change behavior. If you're paying quarterly, that's 6 months that you've got to wait to see, to even start to think you're going to see results from this. If you communicate it to your sales rep, it's the first pay cycle, they're going to probably feel like they understand it. Some of them are going to be too scared to admit they don't. They're just going to be like, okay, whatever. Maybe they get their first check and it aligns with what they thought they were going to do. Second check, something's different. Now's when the questions are going to start to come. So you have to be prepared to explain to them why the plan paid out as it did and what can they do to change their behavior to get more money. The object here, if you're doing this with the right mindset, the object is to pay your people more. You should want your people to make more money, because if you have designed your compensation plan well, they are making more money and you are making more money because you have lined it up so that when they succeed, you succeed. They're doing all the right things and driving your company the way you want it to be driven. So if they're not making money, that's a problem for both you and them. All right, so now let's run through some quick steps to develop your compensation plan, and then I'll show you the examples. All right, so you need to be sure that you're clear about your goals for the business and the strategy used to reach these goals. It's sort of like the saying, if you don't know where you're going, then any path will get you there. You have to define the goal first, right? What are you trying to solve? What's the problem here? Changing compensation is not easy, so don't do it just on a whim. This is not something just to do because you're bored. Do it because there's a problem you need to solve. You need organizational clarity around the process flow and role definition. The good news with most of the trucking roles that I've encountered, whether it's load planner, driver manager, customer service rep, there's not that many different ways that you can combine those roles. I mean, you could have one person doing all three things, or you could split them up, but they're still fairly segmented in terms of the duties that you expect from those roles. Freight brokerage, for whatever reason, is a mess when it comes to organization structure. So there's all different kinds of models for freight brokerages, where you're talking about a cradle to grave model, a pod model like TQL has down south, or you've got the Chicago model that's split. There's all these different approaches to it. So you want to make sure you're clear in terms of process flow and role definition. Hiring plans, training needs assessment, and career paths. It's not just about how much you pay somebody. They want to know that is there an opportunity to get a promotion? Is there an opportunity to get a salary increase? And when? When does that happen? What do I have to do? It's not just about the incentive money. You need to also be sure your organization can execute on this project and that you're doing it at the right time. If it's in the middle of a TMS system changeover, that's not the time to change your compensation plan. This is not a small endeavor. Okay. You need to define your goals and your roles, okay? So there are a variety of different things that are used: revenue, profit per load, average revenue per truck per week. You guys have all the KPIs. That's one thing. This industry has no shortage of KPIs to use. And you probably are tracking them all on a weekly or daily basis. Think about which of those things are going to make sense to use in your incentive plan. Understand how your people affect those things. There's a variety of ways they can affect it, and then there's some things that can happen that they can't affect. One of the things, if you find yourself getting a little bit cold feet about, well, driver retention, how much does a driver manager really impact driver retention? It's absolutely a metric that should be used in a driver manager plan. But how much do they impact it? If they're not cussing out the driver, yeah, that's a good thing. But if the driver decides it's just not the choice for him to do this career, that's not the driver manager's fault. So you want to make sure you're not putting too much pay at risk when there's something that can be outside of that person's control. Just imagine how horrible it would be. I don't think anybody would do this. But if you said, okay, driver manager, 100% of your compensation, you're not even going to get any salary. 100% of your compensation is going to be dependent upon your group of drivers' retention. They would freak out, right? So that gives you an example of why you don't want to have too much pay at risk when there are things that are beyond that person's control. So pay mix is the ratio of salary to incentive. For most driver managers, you're probably not looking at more than 80-20, 75-25 maybe. You want the bulk of the compensation to come from salary, less to come from an incentive, and even less on those metrics that are more outside of their control. Okay. Target total cash. How much should you pay to be competitive with the market? What's the allocation between fixed and variable? I just did that, pay mix. What's the upside look like? If you have a superstar performer, how much is that performer going to make relative to an average performer? Some companies say 3, 4, 5 times. Others don't want that much differentiation between them because they work together as a team. That's a cultural answer that only you guys can answer. What are the pay elements? So what is being measured? Revenue per truck per week, driver retention, unbilled miles, right? Those are all things that are performance measures. When does it count? Is it when a load is shipped, delivered, invoiced, paid? That's crediting point. The relative weight importance of those things. So you're going to weight those elements and you're going to allocate your dollars accordingly. And then the mechanics. Then you get into the fun stuff, which is how do you actually do the calculations? This is what it starts to look like when you can build it out. When you take those dollars, say $10,000 a year as a target incentive amount, you can allocate that among different elements. You might have $5,000 on a financial element, $3,000 on a strategic element, and $2,000 on an overall company piece. There can be modifiers and qualifiers in there as well. Just don't get too wild and crazy with it. But once you realize you can do more than one thing with those dollars, it opens up a lot of possibilities for you. I already went through that stuff. Okay, good performance measures. So if you're looking at that list of KPIs, how do you know which ones to pick? They're going to be relevant. They matter to the business. If somebody takes out their trash 4 times a week, doesn't really matter that much to the business. So you're probably not going to do trash removal as one of the elements in your incentive plan. One thing that you probably would think of, outbound calls, right? If you have a call center type person that's trying to get customers, I've had a number of people say, well, why don't we pay them for the number of outbound calls they make? Because they're going to put their grandma on speed dial, and you're going to have a whole bunch of outbound calls. You're not going to have a whole lot of business. So you want to make sure that it is results-based, not activity-based. 4 or fewer in number. Don't go wild and crazy, okay? Not too many different things in the plan. Nothing less than 20% weight. It's got to be controllable. I already talked about that with the driver retention example, right? Make sure you're not putting somebody's money on something that they can't control. EBITDA is a classic example of that. Not only can they not control it, if we're talking about your frontline employees, they can't control it, they don't understand it, and you aren't going to give them the information that would enable them to know what they did well or poorly to affect that number. Okay, so EBITDA is a really bad thing to use for frontline employees if you truly want to change behavior. If you just want it to be a profit sharing plan, it's fine, but you're not going to change anybody's behavior by giving them an annual bonus based on EBITDA. Objective, okay, so it's free from subjective interpretation. It's not because my manager likes me, but I know for a fact I either did the thing or I didn't do the thing. And it's measurable. As I said before, if you can't track it, you can't pay on it, period, end of story. Because not only do you have to track it going forward, but you have to have some historical data to use to know how to set your bar. What does good look like? You won't know that if you don't have historical data to look at. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this one because I already said more is not a goal. You got that. Because I want to show you some sample designs and then give you guys a few minutes to ask some questions. So this is where stuff starts to get fun. This is how I typically communicate a plan. This is a very simple layout. I call this an overview presentation, overview slide. This plan has 2 elements. The annual target incentive is $13,500, and this is a load planner. So they have element number 1 is revenue per truck. 70% of their plan is on that. And element number 2 is driver retention. 30% of their plan is on that. They have more control over revenue per truck. So I put more weight on that than I did on driver retention. This is just a way for them to see how the 2 pieces line up next to each other with some details about how they work. I didn't do a comprehensive one plan design, so it's not going to be cohesive going from this slide to the next slide, but in a presentation that I would do, the next slide is going to be the detail for how one of those elements works, okay? Typically, when I do revenue per truck, it's just on a little, what I call a tiered table. It has about 9 rungs in it, and they get paid based on where they landed in one of those 9 rungs. Tiered tables aren't that exciting. Matrices are a lot more exciting, okay? So with a matrix, you can do 2 things at once. So it's kind of my cheat on the 4 things, no more than 4 things in a plan. In a matrix, you can fit 2 things into one metric. This was one that I did for a customer service rep. They had a booked loads goal. They needed to book a certain number of loads each month. So the vertical axis was based on their booked loads relative to goal. But then you didn't want them just booking all kinds of crap that you couldn't actually deliver. So the horizontal axis is percentage of booked loads that were delivered, okay? If they were able to book a lot of loads and have a lot of loads delivered, they'd be in the upper right-hand corner of this matrix, and they'd be getting 150% of whatever their monthly target incentive amount is, okay? If they did not get to the lower left-hand corner, 95% of their book loads goal or 85% of loads delivered, they got a big goose egg on this piece. Okay, matrices are fun. You can do a lot with them. You can have one dimension be individual and another dimension be team. If you guys have brokerages, you can do gross margin dollars and load count. You can do gross margin dollars and gross margin percentage. There are a lot of different factors in this world of transportation that play off against each other. Revenue per truck and unbilled miles. right? You can put these things on a matrix because what you really want is somebody that can do well on both of those things. Sometimes I use what I call an KPI, a KPI table, or it can be an individual performance modifier depending on how it's used. This would be handy for, this is a recruiter example that I actually have on here. But when I've had my arm twisted behind my back and actually done accounting department plans, it typically looks something like this, where we're going to have one of the metrics maybe based on days sales outstanding. Another one is average days to bill. Another one is days to close, right? There's sort of this handful of things that any one of them by themselves isn't really that important. But if you put them all together, it gives you a picture of how well that person is doing the job. You keep it simple because there's only a 1 through 5 rating scale. They can either not meet the minimum, meet expectations, exceeds, or meets excellence. So in whatever things you're putting in there, there's only 5 possible outcomes. So it limits the amount of tracking that you have to do to actually do the calculation. This can be done whether it pays out its own value to them, or if you have a team-based element, okay, so maybe based on the overall performance of the group, the target payout is $1,000. Everybody's supposed to get $1,000, but you want to dial because not everybody is as good a performer as everybody else. So you could have a little IPM, individual performance modifier table that sits beside it that says somebody who did great on their personal metrics maybe gets 1,500. Somebody who didn't do so great on their personal metrics only gets 500, right? So I did 50% or 150% of the 1,000. If the team didn't do enough to generate 1,000, then it doesn't matter what somebody did on their own KPIs. 150% of 0 is 0. Right? So in that case, it's dependent upon the team performance first. Okay. This is a tiered, when I talked about a tiered table, very simple, easy to do, easy to understand and communicate, just based on ranges. So if you fall within the range, that determines what the payout is. They don't have to be the same size. I often use 9 just because it gives me the one in the middle is the target, and then I've got 4 above and 4 below. Okay. I've done some fancy driver plans as well. This one's tough. So changing driver plans to do anything other than just raising the cents per mile requires a tremendous amount of courage from an organization to do it. I have worked with companies that have done it, but it's hard because the minute you take one of those 75 things that you're paying drivers for, the minute you take one of those away, even if you look at it and over the last 3 years, it's paid out a whopping total of $15 to all of your drivers, you take that thing, whatever it is, away, somebody's going to have a fit about that, right? Even if they have never been paid anything for it. So you have to be very careful how you do driver compensation plans. This was a fun one to do, though, that it basically gave them an opportunity to create their own raise. So remember I talked about the points thing? They would accumulate points, or they could potentially lose points if they did something badly, but they would accumulate points. And as they got to another point level, that bumped them up, whether it was, a 1/4 cent a mile or 1/2 cent a mile or whatever. So they were able to progress up and get their own raises by accumulating points. Now, we made sure there's a lot of modeling that goes into this. We made sure they couldn't go up too fast, right? We had a rev limiter on this to keep them from accelerating too fast up the scale. They could only get a maximum, it probably says on here somewhere, but like a maximum of 1,000 points a month or something like that. And they'd have to get to 10,000 points till they got to the next level. So we're talking about 10 months would be the fastest they could see an increase. But this actually was pretty well received. All right. Questions? 6 minutes to spare. Anybody comments, questions, reactions, things to share? You guys want to share any horror stories that you have? I heard some chuckling over here about changing driver compensation plans. Anybody done that successfully where it was other than just a penny per mile increase? Yeah? Who's saying yeah? Did you take anything away in the process, or was it just an additive? Yeah, it's hard to ever take it away. Yeah. Safety is actually one of the easiest ones to do, not to discount your good job there, but it's fairly easy to add a safety incentive plan. To get mass participation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Behavior change, right? It's getting the behavior change. Some of them, and having done this now for 24 years, I had one organization where all we were doing was adding money. That's it. Adding money to them. We weren't changing anything else. We weren't taking salary down, which you never want to do anyway, but we were just adding an incentive plan in. They had never had one before. And there were people who were upset about it. It's like, this is an opportunity for you to make more money. That's all this is. But they didn't want the scrutiny. They didn't want to feel like somebody was tracking them, like somebody was, watching what they were doing. They just wanted to do their job. And these weren't bad employees, because I asked management, I said, do you have a problem, with this person who's fussing about this plan? And he said, no, not at all. A good employee, but just, she wanted to just be left alone to do her own thing. I did have one sales rep one time, this still boggles my mind, who just said he didn't want the commission plan, and it could have paid him probably, $100,000 more than what he was making. He said, no, just, give me an extra $5,000 in my salary. That's enough. I went, you're in sales? I don't understand this. It had something to do with an ex-wife and alimony and taxes. And so, but.
Our system is someone brought up the system with families is a negative. Less points you get, better off you are.
Oh, okay. Yep.
We had a discussion about that, about the same thing you said. Taking points away from that's a reverse psychology. Actually, everything you're talking about is psychology. People to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's all psychology.
Yeah, and you have to step back and think about it for a minute, and then you realize the message you're sending may not be what you think you're sending. So. Mm-hmm. Reinforcement. Yeah. Is there something that they all have the handhelds now? Could you do like push out like an ad almost on their thing to get them something to just put it front and center on them every morning? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is more work. Right. Good point there. Yep. So you can't have the fox guarding the hen house, which is why like controllers or CFOs typically should not be on incentive plans that are tied to company financial performance. But you have to keep it, if you keep it to 4 metrics, keep it to things that you already track. And I've seen some large organizations be able to pull this off in Excel. There are software packages, not for this industry, unfortunately. If anybody has like, venture capital money they want to throw my way, this is a business that this industry needs. But there's companies like Synergy and Vericent, that I think they're still Vericent. They were acquired by IBM, then they were divested from IBM. I don't know. But they're companies that do enterprise incentive management. they're all geared around sales. So they can't deal with the volume of transaction or the varied kind of metrics like revenue per truck per week, unbilled miles, all of those kinds of things. They're not set up to deal with that. So 99% of the companies that I work with are doing this in Excel. I mean, even somebody, I've worked with Coyote. Coyote does it in Excel. It's nuts, but Coyote does their compensation plan in Excel. All the way back.
We have my best employee that works the hardest, is always late 2 or 3 days, baker, he didn't get the dollar. He threatened to quit, he didn't get the dollar because he was working as hard as they were being paid for it. So we gave everybody a dollar, just continue the program. Is there a better way to structure that?
Actually, one of the best that I have seen for mechanics is when if you can track SRTs and you can gauge, are they getting the work done in less time than expected without having the trucks come back in the next day because they didn't do the job thoroughly. But if you have that as a mechanism that you can track, that's one of the best ways to incent mechanics, because then it doesn't matter. I frankly, I don't like tracking people's like time coming to work on time, because you don't know if they've got kid issues with daycare and all kinds of stuff that they can't, that they can't control. I know, but there's boundaries, right? Boundaries in there. But instead, thinking about productivity, output, are they able to get more done? And tying a mechanic's pay to that, I think makes a lot more sense. I also, frankly, just don't like any incentive compensation program that just comes across as a disguise of micromanagement, right? That's not what this should be about. This should really be about getting, I don't care how they do it, right? I don't care if they get new customers by text, carrier, pigeon, whatever, right? They got you a new customer, pay them for getting a new customer. Don't, coach them on how to do it. If you've got a plan, this many customer visits a day and whatever, fine. Coach them to that. Reward them for getting it done. All righty. Thank you, guys.